Welcome to Chapter 2, Lesson 5. Our objectives today are just proving angles are congruent. There's two vocabulary words that we talk about in this lesson. One we've already discussed, and that's postulate. Postulate is an accepted statement of fact. We've had many postulates: segment addition postulate, angle addition postulate. So far, those are just statements you accept as fact. Now you have a new word called theorem. And theorem is a statement that you can prove true. So postulate and theorem are in fact the same thing, except one you can prove and one you just accept as fact. Due to the course, the length of the course, and how fast we have to go, we don't prove a lot of the theorems, but every theorem listed in the book you could actually prove. But the bottom line is, postulates and theorems mean the same thing. They're just rules. Rules in geometry that you have to follow. The first theorem that we have in this book is the theorem on vertical angles. You, in fact, already know this, but there's a vertical angles theorem that says all vertical angles are congruent. So given this picture, angle 1 is congruent to angle 2, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 4. Those are vertical angles. They're across from each other, so they're going to be equal. Okay, here's an example, and I want to solve for x. I have a pair of vertical angles. They're across from each other, so they're going to be equal. So I just set them equal to each other. 4x equals 3x plus 35. Then I subtract 3x from both sides, and I get x is 35. Now, if I plug that back into the equation, it doesn't really ask for what the angles equal, but if I plug that back into the equation, I'm going to stick 35 in either this equation, 4x, or 3x plus 35. It won't matter, because they're both equal. If I plug it back into the 4x, 4 times 35 would be 140. So these two angles would be 140 degrees because they're the same. Then the other two angles that aren't really given, I know these are supplementary. So if I take 140 minus 180, these two would have to be 40 and 40. So when I have vertical angles that form an X, if I know one angle, I know them all. Okay, here's a second example. In the second example, again, I have a pair of vertical angles. So 2x plus 3 equals 4x minus 101. So to solve, I set them equal to each other. I have 2x plus 3 equals 4x minus 101. To solve that, I'm going to first move the 2x to the other side. So I'm going to subtract. And I get 3 equals 2x minus 101. Then I'm going to bring the 101 over to the 3. So I'm going to add. So I get 2x equals 104. Then to get x all by itself, I'm going to divide by 2. So I'm going to get x equals 52. Now, if I were to plug that in, I could be done, because all it does is say solve for x. X is 52. But to plug that back in and to find out what those, in fact, angles equal, which I know they should be obtuse, I'm going to plug 52 back into either one of those equations. I'm going to pick the easier one. And I'm going to pick 2x plus 3. So I'm going to get 2 times 52 plus 3. Well, 2 times 52 is 104. 104 plus 3 is 107. So each of these angles equal 107. Now the other pair of vertical angles are these angles in blue. And if I know the pink ones are 107, I know these two form 180. So if I subtract 180, or I'm sorry, if I subtract 107 from 180, I get 73. So these blue angles are 73. It makes sense. The two obtuse angles are 107, and the two acute angles, which are blue, are 73. Any adjacent consecutive angles equal 180. Okay, two other theorems in this section that are important to know, and pretty much they're common sense. One of them is, well, there's two that are related to right angles. The first one says all right angles are congruent. Makes sense. If you have a right angle, it equals 90 degrees. So no matter how many you have, they're all going to be congruent to each other. So all right angles are equal. And then another theorem that deals with right angles says this: if two angles are congruent and they're supplementary, so whenever I see that word, I have to think of 180 degrees. So if two angles are congruent and supplementary, then each has to be a right angle. So basically, when you have supplementary, you have a line. If I have two angles, they're congruent and they're supplementary, the only kind of angles I can have are two right angles. So basically, in this section, all we're doing is identifying what's a theorem and what's a postulate. Postulate is an acceptance statement of fact. Theorem is the same idea, but I can prove it. I can prove that fact. And then the key theorems in this section were vertical angles are congruent, all right angles are congruent. If two angles are congruent and supplementary, they have to be right angles.